the very small chance that somebody in the room doesn't know me, but the very likely chance that somebody watching this on YouTube 10 years from now has no idea who I am. I'm Nicholas DiMoncho, head of department here at MIT. I'm very glad to, is this microphone on, Joel? No, it's not. It's on? Okay, there we go. Okay, very good. Again, my name is Nicholas DiMoncho, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the first lecture of our Spring 2025 lecture series, and to introduce my good friend and a visitor to the school, Mark Smout, of the London-based practice Smout Allen, who have opened an amazing exhibit this evening that you can also go and see after the lecture, and we'll hear more about it tonight. I did not know Mark when I first invited him to the University of California, Berkeley in 2011, and he came to speak for a symposium on landscape and infrastructure and urbanism that I was putting on at the time, with amazingly well, with the same kind of beautiful drawings you'll see tonight. But my great memory from that visit is at the reception afterwards, I introduced Mark to my wife Kate, who's here tonight, and they had a conversation for about an hour in a corner of the reception, which, and then afterwards I said to Kate, "Oh, did you enjoy talking to Mark Smout?" And Kate said, not only, "Oh, that was Mark Smout," she said, "Oh, that was an architect?" And to those of you who are already embedded in architectural culture, you realize it's actually quite an astonishing thing to have a conversation for an hour with an architect without necessarily talking about anything that is obviously architecture, although many things are latently architecture. And I mentioned this tonight, not only to embarrass Mark and Kate, but also to reflect a little bit that you know, the Smout Allen has a very, very interesting and I believe very important practice, because the irony of the statement is that in fact the practice is at the very core of architecture and what architects do, which is to say the practice is mostly about the production of models and drawings and other forms of media, which is precisely what architects do. Architects don't build buildings, they produce media that cause the world to be built, sometimes in very specific and detailed ways, sometimes in very general ways. And so in many ways the practice could not be more architectural, but it is full of an enormous and wide-ranging curiosity about the whole world, and particularly about the issues of climate, which architecture is deeply implicated in, but which of course are rooted in effect much more, many more layers of society. And so in many ways I want to thank Mark and Laura indirectly for coming and sharing the practice, which, as I say, is at once quintessentially architectural, but also incredibly focused on the non-architectural issues that we need to both engage and incorporate into our practices. Mark Smout and Laura Allen are both professors of architecture and in Mark's case also landscape futures at the Bartlett University College London, where they run the highly successful Unit 11 and also are co-founders and administrators of the Landscape MA course. They're both honorary fellows of the Royal Institute of British Architects, and I won't embarrass Mark any further by going on about the many amazing things they've done, but it's just an enormous pleasure on behalf of the school and the department to welcome Mark here tonight and to kick off this lecture, which we hope will also become very quickly a conversation with all of you. So with that, Mark, take it away.
Hey, thank you. That's, yeah, it's a very nice introduction. I think architecture sort of touches everything, doesn't it? So we find it quite easy to have conversations about everything that surrounds architecture, but maybe not what you might think is the sort of the core of it all. But I guess what I was going to do, actually, unusually, is thank everyone at the beginning, so I don't forget at the end, which is usual. So I'd just like to thank, you know, Nicholas and Kate for Nicholas for getting me over here, Nicholas and Kate for their hospitality, and obviously Joelle for helping with the exhibition, Alex for the lighting, and Dulcie and Charles for their sartorial help this morning with my clothes. Slightly passive-aggressive conversation about what I was wearing, but anyway. And just thank you for having me here so I can just talk you through some of our latest work. So I think the first thing I will explain perhaps is the title, because that's what a lot of people ask about. So it's kind of, I don't know if anyone's familiar with Mary Poppins. There's a horse racing scene in there, and it's sort of it's a very interesting nonsense compound word made up of, which is supercalifragilistic. In our case, we have super, which is above, mega, which might mean something that's very large, rural, the country, and listic, which means something that's characterized by something. And it seems very appropriate, straightforward, and I now consider the matter closed. So, Super-Mega-Ruralistic is a response to a research project and exhibition titled Regional Globalism in the Tennessee Valley. It was set up at the University of Tennessee, the College of Architecture and Design there, and it's a project that was led by Mika Rutenberg and Jason Young, and it featured lots of other people as well. We weren't the only people there. There's RVTR, Post, and the Open Workshop, and many others. So regional globalism explored how the Tennessee Valley became a testing ground for modernization, shaped by New Deal-era policies and large-scale infrastructure projects. And it was managed by organizations like the Tennessee Valley Authority, Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The region has been a site of energy development, environmental management, and technological progress. Looking at these institutions together, the Regional Globalism Project consisted of 2 symposia, followed by an exhibition and a future publication. Future publication, for anyone here who is a non-academic guest means that it's not quite a book yet. So hopefully there will be. And those publications and exhibitions examine the combined influence of all those agencies on design, urbanism, and regional planning, showing how they continue to shape the local landscapes and the broader landscapes in that area. So the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, was established in 1933 as part of Roosevelt's New Deal, which I'm sure you all know, and it was aimed to modernize the Tennessee Valley, as it was devastated at the time by the Great Depression. It was conceived as a large-scale regional planning experiment, and the TVA focused on flood control, electricity generation, agricultural improvement, and economic development. And it spanned the 41,000 square miles of the valley. It reshaped the Tennessee River system, controlling the 11,000 miles of shoreline alongside it, and the construction of lots of dams and hydroelectric power plants, which provided power to lots of urban and rural communities. So the TVA remains as I think it's the largest public utility in the US at the moment, and it's sort of adapting its legacy and kind of looking forward and looking at renewable energy and sustainable land management. But the question for this project was is Tennessee ready for the form of change that we're proposing? The climate's changing very rapidly. Extreme rainfall, as you probably heard about in that area, is intense and less predictable than it's ever been. The summertime precipitation may decrease by the end of this century. Some types of extreme weather events, such as extreme heat waves, drought, and heavy rainfall, are likely to increase. And there is something called the Ready or Not report, which is an evaluation of state climate and water preparedness, found that Tennessee was lagging sort of quite a long way behind where it should be in its ability to absorb any of those changes. One of the statements from there was, floods may be more frequent and droughts may be longer, which would increase the difficulty of meeting the competing demands for water in the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. So periods of drought will affect water supplies by reducing groundwater levels, and the flood mitigation ability of all the dams along in the TVA system, although effective on a day-to-day basis, are unlikely to be able to cope with that massive fluctuation in the future. So this is the US drought monitor, which shows live drought conditions across the US. This was taken at the end of the summer, and it shows the whole of Tennessee is currently, was at the time that was taken, in drought, with most areas in moderate drought, but many areas in severe drought. These drought levels, and at this time of year, which is the end of the summer, agricultural ponds dry up, and people have to resort to hauling water around. And when that happens, things like disease spread more quickly among live and fish stock, leaves fall early, crops get severely stressed, etc., and producers have a difficult time because of that. And of course, there's things like burn bans going into place, and there's the difficulty associated with wildfires. So an example location here, so we could zoom into Nashville, and you can see the whole area was in severe drought when that image was taken. And it is a city that will slip into extreme drought category. So at that point, then, the water supply is just inadequate for wildlife to thrive. So there are various predictions with those, with the models that were put up, and it was that total water withdrawals in 2040 were predicted to decrease by 19%. But that, that is a result of thermoelectric plants not taking as much water out of the system. However, water use by industry is projected to increase by 16%, and public supplies is projected to increase as well, and so is irrigation by at least half. But sort of what does this mean, and what does this mean to the sort of exhibition I've got going on in there, and what can be done? The increased unpredictability of all of this, and the increased unpredictability of water supply levels have a huge impact on agriculture and food availability. And small farmsteads, of which there are many, have all begun to test alternative models for farming in that site, and that just to be able to absorb the shocks of climate change. Some of those methods include agroforestry and forest gardens. Forest gardens grow produce as part of the forest floor ecosystem. These are all things that you can look up. I won't go into detail now. Silver pasture, which is the grazing of livestock in forests. Pocket pond networks, which for irrigation during droughts. Localized food management, things like that. And this is a place called Spiral Ridge, which is in Tennessee, and it uses the pocket pond network system amongst the food forest. So it encourages sort of wildlife like dragonflies and damselflies that eat all the other insects that could damage the plants, and it can also be used for irrigation. So that was a really interesting system. Another example of small-scale experimental farming in Tennessee is the what's this one? Yes, the Obed Forest Garden. And it focuses on community farming and food shortage programs and things like that. And they don't use any herbicides, no pesticides or chemical fertilizers. Instead, they've developed these bio-intensive processes using dependable organic natural procedures that will sort of establish native habitats and food forests. They also do other things as well. They follow, that process is followed by dense seeding and mass planting of bare root plants. So it's called deep mulch occultation, and that is followed by dense mass planting. They're sort of great band names for those brave souls out in the audience who are into your thrash metal, I think. So there's another farm, it's called the Earth Advocates Research Farm, and they look at what is called ethnobotanical research, and it's basically a nursery for drought-resistant plants and for evolving plants that are growing in that site. And it's an off-grid farm with a huge PV system and lots of cisterns, and it's run by these amazing people down here, the fantastically named Adam and Sue Turtle, who run this place. And finally, there's this place called the New Forest Farm, which is a diverse restoration agriculture research site in, this is actually in Wisconsin. It's a long way from Tennessee, but what's interesting here is the scalability of how they approach their solutions. And it's all about runoff and distribution of runoff with these amazing patterns you see in the landscape. So another side to this is looking at sort of energy and renewables and buffering that energy production. So at the moment, I think 10% of the valley's energy comes from hydro generation, but the TVA is planning to roll out more of that in the coming years, and particularly focusing on solar and wind power. And they have sort of various carbon-free energy proposals. Well, They did as of last summer. I'm not quite sure. I haven't caught up with what's happening there at the moment. But they're sort of promoting carbon-free energy production. But what's quite odd is that there's a sort of contradictory system within the TVA where they are continuing to spend billions on fossil fuel investments. So they're commissioning fossil fuel plants, but they're also they're decommissioning fossil fuel plants, but they're also commissioning gas plants there. So there is a sort of dichotomy between those two problems. The TVA, though, is absolutely perfectly placed to invest in other large-scale renewable programs. So things like floating solar farms could be deployed across the TVA's huge reservoirs they have there. You know, it's effectively free land to put this stuff on. And floating solar farms are much more efficient than ones on the ground because they can cool them and they're generally they can make them point towards the sun a bit easier. So sort of quick idea number one we had on Raccoon Mountain. Raccoon Mountain is where there's a pumped hydro storage scheme. You can see on the right there. Where water is pumped up to the top of a mountain when there's not much demand for electricity, and then it's allowed to flow down the mountain and generate electricity when there's a lot of demand. Places like this also have a key infrastructural role in areas because they're one of the places that can restart nuclear power stations, because essentially if there's a power cut, you need an awful lot of power to restart a gas or a nuclear power station. If you need that burst of energy, you just have to essentially turn a tap on in this hydropower thing and it'll restart. It's called a black start when everything goes off and you need to restart the system, and it's always done through pumped hydro systems. There's one in Wales where I was born, which is called Dinorwic, which is quite an interesting place if you want to look that up. Wales isn't an interesting place, but this place is interesting in there, I think. So, in this idea, we had, we start drawing ideas about using the surface of the reservoir as a floating photovoltaic farm. The energy would support small-scale farming. There could be a community of houses which grow up around this thing, and they could control the waterscape of the reservoir around it, around the sort of riparian territory, where water and land-based diversity might start to be encouraged. And there's also ideas of trails and amenity around there that connect the area to the space around it. So you can see on here, there's pocket ponds, riparian edges, farmsteads, houses, public recreation sites, and routes and paths, and some funny little sketches on the right. So further downstream from the Tennessee River, we've got quick idea number 2, which is in Sweetens Cove. Here you can see the continuation of the flat-top hilly topography and small sort of tributary valleys leading into the Tennessee River. This one's occupied by a very marshy landscape, some very low-density housing, and of course the obligatory golf courses around there as well. So our idea for this one was that we would look at manipulating the hydrology at a much smaller scale, like the scaled farm I showed you before. You can see it up here, for local use and rather specialized greenhouse-based farming. So we'd be making use of the meanders to enclose distinct territories and floating solar farms wrapped by the entirety of a riparian buffer around them. And this is, again, you'll see lots of sketches throughout. This is a sort of the sketch that looks like the flattened mouse on the right there. That's where most of the ideas start, in ideas like that, and then they become things. So what could this farm be in this new context, or what could these farmsteads be in this new context? So farming dominates Tennessee. There's 77,000 farms, millions of acres, and 40% of that land of Tennessee's land is devoted to farming, and it ranks very highly in the country's farming list. And the number one commodity, I think, is cattle, and that's followed very closely by soybeans, and then there's other things after that. So Tennessee is also home to a series of agri-research and agricultural education centers, which focus on future-proofing farming in the Tennessee Valley. For example, this is the Plateau Agri-Research and Education Center, There's lots of research that goes on here. It's 2,000 acres in a number of locations, and they do lots of research into beef and fruit, vegetable, field crops, and pigs. I think this provides the ideal setting for an ornamental and experimental research into that plateau environment. Specifically, I think it's called the Cumberland Plateau. And there are lots of grants that are available for farmers to find out about these programs. They have programs that are about herd health and genetics and row crop solutions and hay storage and things like that. But perhaps most interestingly, one of the major grants they offer is for producer diversification. So they offer money for farmers to try and do something else alongside what they're doing. So that might be things for agritourism, perhaps, or experimental fruit and vegetable growing in some form. And there are sort of various initiatives promoting diverse local farm produce and farmers markets locations at the general public as well. So it creates a very close relationship between the farms and the communities they serve. So they also are very keen on the idea of farmers moving away from monoculture farming, which is typically not very resilient. And the challenge here, of course, and across the world, I guess, is that public expectations have to move away from year-round crop availability, perhaps, and instead towards a sort of more reactive, less rigid food supply chain, which can respond to climate change a bit easier. These are just images of the farmers involved in that grant funding process, and they set up live demonstrations of what they're doing. And the ultimate goal of the program like this is that they advance the use of technologies that quickly and reliably help farmers make very solid decisions about using less water, less land, and fewer inputs, which are vital to the future of vital to their future. Yeah, this is just more of that. Yeah. So another slightly more serious issue is that farmers are now getting much older and farm longer in life. So it's a sign that farming doesn't seem to be necessarily a viable career. So I believe the latest figures are it's like the average age of a farmer is 58, and that is that's a North American and a European problem as well. And 1 in 3 is considered an age beyond retirement age. So there are lots of things at play here. There's kind of poverty, race, economic and social politics all play an enormous part in this. Those statistics are much more complex than you could possibly sort of go into this evening. But the reality is that farmers are dwindling, and so is an inherent technical connection to the land. So we kind of think this isn't helping anyone, so we want our riverine model farm to be a model farm that attracts younger farmers from a broader range of backgrounds and encourage them to stay the distance. So the TVA, of course, brought agricultural modernization to rural economies in Tennessee by establishing model farms that served as centers of knowledge and experimentation and promoted different ways of working, new technical ways of working with the land. And that was a revolution, really, in how it all worked. And having improved their financial position since the war, Tennessee farmers began mechanizing their operations and went from about 10,000 to over 100,000 farms, while the population actually declined. So skipping forward 80 years, we now have at our disposal a sort of plethora of technologies to aid ever-intensified farming, and autonomous agriculture machinery, or helping hands, as we call it in this project, that are developed for precision farming, use data analytics and automation to optimize agricultural production. So in the main, these things are getting very simple to use. They're a bit like your Roomba that might hoover up around your house. You only need to transport them to a field, and then they're made of the rest. So the Super-Mega-Ruralistic model farm proposal uses the idea of the semi-automation, or an automation on standby for call-up. Statistics show that farmers in these areas have multiple jobs and time pressures, so having a helping hand like this would really assist them in their position. So further research into the future of farming led me to the University of Tennessee's Ag Research Center. This is from the TVA Experimental Field Station, but is now in the university there. It was a really interesting trip, looking at wheat breeding, switchgrass, stuff like that, and about how seasons can be extended with tunnels and things like that. The images you see here are mountain mint, and on the right, test panels for sports turf testing and development plots for varieties of the mountain mint on the left. I mean, I did seem to take an awful lot of photographs of the sports grass areas, though, because it's like multiple football fields laid out as far as the eye could see in every direction, and sort of funny machines rolling around on them. Of particular interest there were these greenhouses on the campus, which have these shadowy sort of shipping containers. You know, there were things going on in there that we clearly couldn't talk about, but they were growing kale in the Fresh Electric farm, which I think I'm going to retain as a project idea, actually, the Fresh Electric farm. I think that sounds fantastic. But it's looking at light consumption in plants and monitoring them in an enclosed space. They also are looking at high-value crops in greenhouses under different wavelengths of light. And this is a growth area of research. So a quote from them is, "We already know that deep ultraviolet LED light preserves strawberries, and ultraviolet light makes red lettuce a deeper red with more antioxidants. But the findings open the door to many more studies regarding the wavelength-dependent attributes of fruits and plants. Light can be used to improve flavor or change flavor signatures and nutritional content of fruits and vegetables, and even the scent of flowers." So once you get into the world of looking at these amazing greenhouses, it's very difficult to get out the internet and stop looking at them. So you look at these wonderful light shows. I think this is the one that's in Iceland. That's the one in Iceland on the left with barley. And that's the herb research department in Aarhus. So they're looking at altering the flavors of herbs with LEDs. You know, these are ones that are outside. Admittedly, this is taken with a long exposure photograph. And it's done by an environmental artist, Studio Rosegard, and I suspect it can be really appreciated if you're close up and walking through this thing. But it's an amazing project if you look it up. And lots of more coloured greenhouses. Oh, the joy. They're just fantastic when you look at them, I think. So there's lots of research out there that's telling us that the different forms, different wavelengths of light can adjust things. So in the world of super-rural megalithic, we're proposing fluctuating light fields where this research and commercial work can take place. However, we're also proposing that the electricity consumption linked to powering these systems can be provided as a kind of buffer to any renewable generation going on the grid. So essentially, there's a local light signature that would only happen in that area, and it's a link between climate and human activity in the Tennessee Valley, a very unique moment. I couldn't resist putting these in. This is a German photographer, Tom Hagen, the Greenhouse series. So these are all photographs flying over Holland. And they look amazing, I think. So, of course, we couldn't avoid mentioning Andrea Branzi's Agronica, which we were inspired by. And although agricultural in nature, Branzi's project is an urban neighborhood critiquing a city and countryside hybrid on an urban scale. Industrialization, mechanization, and systemization are imagined as urban. However, it's clear that mechanical and digital technologies have infused agrarian practices, and the cultivation of nature is as much an urban as a countryside condition. Our proposal is perhaps the flip side of Branzi's scheme, taking reference from emerging farming practices and the history of the TVA, climate change effects, and the cultural and political stories of the region. So, the French talk at length about the terroir, which is the characteristics given by a particular climate and location, and the unique ground where a grape is grown. So, what we're proposing is something called luxoir, where a flavor profile will be generated by the connection between the electrical profile and the wavelength of the light in that greenhouse. So it's, as I said, it's connecting the human activity and the climate to the food. So you would get a new economy, a direct connection to both land and renewables, and a public and private visual delight, little tasty morsels of full spectrum Tennessee. So quick idea number 3 on the top of that is just looking at the tight river meanders of the Cumberland River that sort of snake around the place through Nashville. And this is a place called Bell's Bend, where it's a large agrarian community, very close to an urban community. This is the conservation corridor there, and it has agricultural value, it has cultural value, historical value, etc. And there's a lot of urban encroachment onto the bends on this site, which is very evident. There's a prison, there's an airport, etc., all the way around it. And so these bends seen in transects, taken in section across the bends, show interesting relationships between the landscape and the river as it meanders out from Nashville. So we're starting to look at using this data we can find to build more information on the topographies. But we thought it's slightly more interesting to consider the transects that run as parallel as possible to the rivers, but also across the floodplains through the agricultural fertile plain. And you'll see this come back into the models later on. And these are the USGS national land use maps for that area. You can see that the river isn't bridged anywhere, and so there's the river has formed a firm line between the urban and the rural. These are just some images of the rather dreadful floods they have there. They have quite regular 1,000-year floods now. Well, I think they had over 13 inches of rain in one day a few years back, which sounded terrible. So we've begun this part of our study particularly focusing on Bell's Bend, which has a distinctive and extensive floodplain and large areas of flat agricultural land that sort of leads to the forested hills. So this is a sort of preliminary project, and there's a way you can see that we work. Just overlaying information and patterns of territories where we can kind of interrogate ideas and opportunities. With the smaller sketch below is starting to look at the sort of the overlay of existing farm zones and raised areas, etc. And you can see the transects as routes from automation and test sites being drawn over the top of that, and how it intersects with the floodplain, the agricultural land, additional reservoirs, energy production, etc. And then when you zoom in on one of those transects, there's a possible arrangement. You kind of zoom into a different scale. We put in a possible arrangement of farmsteads, riparian solar farms, more autonomous farming, and smaller scale allotments, and the high value test beds will be shown in there as well. So this could also have things like the light patterns or recipes, you might call them, for the flavor signatures as they flow up and down the fields. So we come to the Riverine Model Farm. I will skip along to this. This is the final site for the project that you see in the exhibition, and it's in Johnsonville, East Tennessee, and that was, it's permanently flooded by the creation of the Kentucky Dam in 1944. And the damming also assisted in commercial navigation, so it became and power generation, so it did sort of provide, it gave something back to the community, even though they lost a lot of land. So, on our site plan, the grey hatch here, you see at the top, indicates a special flood hazard area from the flood insurance rate maps of that site. And it shows them subject to inundation by the 1% annual chance flood, which is the 100-year flood. That doesn't mean it happens once every 100 years. It happens a lot more regularly than that. And on here you can see our first attempt at showing the sort of yellow lights casting out over the valley. Very nice. This is an example as well of Laura's sketchbook, just showing how some of the sketches and the drawings actually work in tandem. Very nice. Laura was very fortunate in that she had all of her sketchbooks displayed in the Royal Academy last year, which was quite an amazing sight. There were 8 of these things just laid out in all on the best pages. It was, well, I have to keep a sketchbook as well, and my sketches aren't like that, I tell you, so it's quite worrying, but very good. So early sketches for trying to bind all these ideas together. show us trying to examine that topography and the very shallow elevations of the floodplain and the riparian banks of the river. And these are just drawings where we try and assemble some of these ideas together very tentatively, the first steps into that process. So inserted into that drawing would be this model farm community of agricultural and domestic buildings, courtyards and paddocks. So a little bit more of our working method is creeping in here. You know, the sketch, there's always the sketch, and there's always a little dash of anthropomorphism with the sketches as well. So I think in this case, this design was called the weak hat, I think. Kind of described it rather well. The strongest architectural reference for us was that of the cantilever barn, which you probably all know about. It's a distinctive feature of East Tennessee, and it evolved in response to a changing farm practice and a sort of a combination as well of imported European vernacular as well. I think there's barns like that in Holland. And unlike ordinary barns, the second story is lofted above ground level cribs, creating a kind of sheltered understory where animals and workers could keep out the rain, and you could pull wagons right into the heart of them. There's also a lot more ventilation on the top. They're quite rare today, and they're quite fall about, a lot of them, but you can still see them. So we interpreted the cantilever barns in many ways. As you can see, this is a sample of a few of them. I think these may have started as sketches and then became card models. You just cut them out. They're actually just quite nice to have as objects knocking around the studio. And they sort of, maybe they establish a design language of proportional volumes and stacked spaces. Some of them look at the undercroft and the direct connection to the land. Some of them look at merging the domestic and the agricultural into this hybrid typology. Some of them are about rotating the roof to a pitch. Some of them are about conjoining them or elongating them. So here's another sketch. This is the dehydrated snake. That's what we call that one. It's an interesting one. So what we're trying to do here with the barn lexicon in mind was design these sort of domestic, recreational, and infrastructural architecture that integrates environment with dynamic, that sort of demonstrates the flows and movements and checks and balances of this very fluid landscape. Our model farms would be a sort of new generation of what were called experimental stations. So they would model physical and scientific futures and provide a living space as well. And looking further again, we began to establish corrals and platforms. Another spirited sketch from Laura, and a 1 to 500 planimetric on the right, showing scales and territories and arrangement of the farms. So generally, we are creeping towards design when we do it. We don't sort of just pile in and do a massive model or something like that. It's always sketch, a little bit bigger, maybe a little bit bigger again. And I think that's a function of us being primarily architectural tutors, that we're very aware of the perils of moving up too quickly or not being able to get to where you're trying to go to. Not that we know where we're trying to get to, but being frightened by where you're trying to get to. So you can see on these ones here, we start slotting in the greenhouses, which are the hatched bits here. And then there are other greenhouses that are nestled in the corral of maybe higher value crops that you can see the grey areas there, and they're at a different scale over there. Both of these drawings are in the exhibition. And then if we just zoom on the plan a little bit, this is what you were talking about, architecture, isn't it? Yeah, this is the architecture bit, so you may want to just have a break or move around a bit. These are sort of, you'll see, you can see here how the farm units are sitting on top of these platforms, and then there's the sort of surrounding landscape around them. So it provides a sort of, the corral would provide a buffering zone between the building and the world outside, and then the world outside and the world beyond that, i.e. the sort of riparian forests around the rivers, there's another buffer as well. So there's kind of layers like an onion skin in there. So there's lots of ways to get to the raised surface on the farm, and there's lots of ways to anchor the elements as well, as you can see here on the left. We could elevate farm equipment away from flood and provide water and power to the platform. So if there is a flood, you can lift things up, take them away. Interestingly here, in Tennessee, there are bird boxes made of dried gourds, and they hang from poles at various places, and they're nesting sites for purple martins. And the traditional practice fosters a sort of relationship between farmers and wildlife, and the martins help control insect populations and serve as a natural deterrent to the hawks there. What is this one? This is the, this is more about the corrals. This is a sort of a vernacular fencing system. I guess this fencing system is made for a ground that you can't easily drive a stake into to make a solid corner for a fence, but maybe you have lots of the wood left over, so this is a very particular way of doing it. And it's, and we were kind of, well, we weren't trying to copy that, but there's the idea of protecting certain areas of the farm that we were interested in there. And this is a closer look at the greenhouses, which would house the high-value luxoir crops, such as mountain mint was one of them, and ginger. And these will be the very lit areas, these bits that are pulled out of there. These will be the bits that flood the light around the landscape. There would be things like pick-and-place robots that might exist in these greenhouses, and there'd be multispectral lighting, and things like that. So also hoppers and silos. So these would be the connective threads between what's above and what's below. So you can pile stuff in the top and release it out below, or you can draw stuff up from below and have it on top. They're the connective tissue there. Openings and apertures, in this case for a tree, which will allow stuff to travel between the layers or to be stored interstitially, so there might be holes in the platforms for vegetation to come through. And there's this kind of maybe a mechanized gantry system for you to lift some of the heavier items or transport grain or fuel or whatever it is around the place. The buildings, this is a recurring motif of how we design things, in that it's easier to see on the model, this actually. So you would have a hulk and a shell, as we call it. So there's a lump, the purple lump there, which is the building proper, and then there is a shell that goes around it. And we like to play, as you can see on the plan, I mean, it's very obvious on the models as well, play with those interstitial spaces where you're half inside and half outside. Each model farm consists of 4 or more barns, where sort of agriculture and domestic activities are interwoven. The farmsteads, you'll notice on the plan and on the model there, they're turned into each other, but they're also turned away from each other. They face the farmyard, but they also face the horizon. So the variety is to encourage social interaction on one hand, but also to offer, to afford privacy on the other in their arrangement. These are the helping hand systems. So they would be using the smart technologies I talked about earlier to do some precision farming around the place. This system we envisage would relieve farmers from having farming as a 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year activity. So if you miss something, maybe there will be some automation that would automatically fill in. The relentlessness of the farming lifestyle is something that drives a lot of young people and families away. So if there was the equivalent of if there was something stepping in for you, if you just happened to go out one night, that would encourage a lot of people to take this up as a lifestyle. So, restless drawings. This is a theme that again is recurring throughout all of our work over the years. Started perhaps with a project we did it seems like 100 years ago. It was about a village that retreated from the edge of a landscape in the UK, a landscape that was diminishing. It was just pulling itself away. These are the final drawings of this project. So there are a pair of drawings that try and capture all of the research and spatial propositions and the culture and the history and the future. So there's a pair of 1 to 100 planometrics. Again, a very nice sketch that starts the thing, and a very unusual projection to portray it all. So I don't know if you know, there's a very interesting book called Western Objects, Eastern Fields, which is by Peter Wilson, which kind of has a series of drawings and it's a theatre of drawings, perhaps, which are looking at architecture in this kind of projection. So we were looking at that. What's interesting about this is that this is another sort of very restless but sparing drawing, is that you're the kind of you're the owner of this drawing, and you can decide what to put in there, and you can decide what to leave out. If you're just ploughing along with Rhino or whatever you're using, it gets very difficult to leave things out, even the most unimportant stuff. And you recognise this amongst yourselves. We recognise it amongst ourselves. But if you take it all out of there, and then try and work on it again, strip away stuff that isn't interesting, keep the stuff in that is telling the narrative or the most interesting, the strongest parts of the story, it sort of starts to come alive. So you can pick out some of the things I've been talking about around here. So that's essentially how we often end projects. We also create what we call restless models. So as you've probably worked out, we're always trying to work out ways to imagine new architectures that operate in these restless relationships. As with our drawings, the models are conceived similarly, and like our drawings, they're often kinetic. They contain multiple viewpoints. They're reconfigured. They're often things that you can hold in your hand. They can be repositioned, and real and hypothetical interaction is kind of encouraged. There's sometimes models we create that look like you can hold them, but you can't, or the ones that you feel like you should stay away from, but you can actually fiddle around with if you want. A couple of nice things here I quite like. This is from Annie Get Your Gun. So this is just a backdrop scene where the sky is kept as a single painted surface, but there are 3 layers there's a foreground, middle ground, and background, all spinning around there at different speeds, so you never get the sort of same image twice. That was a very nice model. And the one on the right is from, it's a flight simulator over a bit of English landscape. I'm not quite sure of the date of that, I can't remember, but it's quite a fantastic device. An example of a sort of a restless model like that is this, which is one of my favourite models we've made, I think. This is for a very dark bit of the UK. It's for an observatory in the Kielder Forest. And it's a model that has 2 intersecting sinusoidal curves like that. So you peer in through the top. There's a hole in the top of this model, and you look down, and you see the mirrored surface there. When the two curves are open, light's coming in, and you can see the model. When they close, they slowly close over a period of whatever it was. I think it was a day. They would close, and you see the constellation coming through the bottom of the model against a very, very, very dark sky. The lights, the color we painted the inside of it was very sort of Yves Klein, but the light would just diminish in there over the day. It was really, really beautiful. And this is a very old model that was designed for people to come up to and fiddle with and twist. It was about looking at a building that sits on the edge of a cliff, and that cliff is retreating, and so you can just keep twisting it and playing with it and look at the paraphernalia of haulage and things like that from lots of different angles. These are this is how we begin with models for generally, and this is Super-Mega-Ruralistic. So they build on the drawings and all the mapping work that we've done, and they work with design both empirically and conceptually. And again, lots of sketches to try and convey the spirit of those dynamic systems in the scheme. We were going to build 3. You'll note there are only 2 in there. So you prototype with whatever seems appropriate in terms of scale and material. Just anything goes at the beginning, and just knock things together. Trying to understand the scale of what the houses might be like, trying to understand the scale of what the landscape might be like. And then this is parts of the final model. So you can see the gantry that we were talking about is half soldered, half glued, half 3D printed. It's just kind of, these things are created in your hands, which are quite nice. And then we're trying to understand what the spaces might be like that people might occupy. So this is sort of final model you can see in the exhibition. So the farm buildings, the cantilever barns, the wooden bits, they're very sort of material. The red platforms are notional greenhouses that are these luxoir platforms, so they might shed light. And then you can see very clearly the elevation of the model from the ground. The other model in the show is intended to show the concept of luxoir and the fluctuating frequencies of light emanating from those greenhouses. So this is the base drawing on the model. If you're looking down on the model, so on the right, there's a scale drawing of the buildings and the platforms, and then to the bottom and the left, as you see there, there are descriptions of the landscape beyond. So the idea was that it's a film. That's exciting, isn't it? Speeded up, of course. The idea was that there'd be a very slow motor that turns here, and it would turn these prisms, and it would slowly change the wavelength of the light that sits in the model. So you might be looking at it one day, and you'll see how the light floods out across the valley and beyond, and then you come back a few hours later, and it might have changed. The string itself travels about 1/16 of an inch every 2 hours, or 1/32 of an inch, 1 hour. You know, say it how you like. So you know, you can watch that taking place, but it is so slow. It's well, whether it works or not, I don't really know. But either way, you'll hopefully remember it, and that'll be enough. I would have thought. So it's very nice to look out for the strips of light along the side as they get projected out across what are the notional greenhouses. So it's quite interesting, this model. This is quite a good example of what we do, in that there's some scaled stuff there. There's some stuff that is the Z scale is completely wonky. There's some massive things and bearings and prisms that don't really exist in real life there. And then there's a very figurative drawing of the landscape that surrounds it. But it's actually intended to come together and create a kind of understanding of what the place might be like. The third model that doesn't exist. And then, as you'll see in the exhibition, we have some screen prints from the A83 gallery in New York. And this is a rhizo. They've just produced this limited edition as part of a drawing group that we're part of, and there's like 14 drawings in there or something, and this is ours on the right. And it was we were meant to respond to something in the gallery, but we never did. We were looking at how we could draw the fluctuating light levels across this very technical landscape, and they did it with some sort of really nice screen printing techniques, as you can see here. These are the bigger drawings as well, and it's really interesting to try and understand how these drawings would work conceptually, I think, because it's dark color plan paper, it's imperial blue color plan paper. On top of that, there is a white surface that is laid on that is the base of the architecture. There's the details of the architecture that are then inked on in black. And then the split fountain, which is the flood of light across the landscape, is a translucent layer over the top of that. So if you look very carefully, it looks like it's shiny, this stuff here, but actually it isn't. It's a very fine cast of color across the things there. They are for sale if you want to sell some of your American Bitcoin and cash in. There'll be an investment for your kids. It'd be a really good thing to do. So I've got Liquid Kingdom I could talk about just very quickly. 4 slides. Seems reasonable. I've come a long way. I mean, I was going to leave it there, but I'd quickly show you a previous project we did which led up to this project, which is quite interesting. It's called Liquid Kingdom, and it was our intro to Knoxville. And it was commissioned by the University of Tennessee, and it's kind of been, I can't remember the date. I was told, someone in the audience told me when it was, and I think it's 2017 or something. And it was a proposal for a supersize miniature, an island in its own right. So it was providing a place to see, experience, measure, and analyze the British landscape. Seaside and leisure amenities, such as boating lakes, swimming pools, beaches, and putting greens, were secreted in various research installations in this program, aiming to bridge the much-debated gap between research, academia, local user groups, and the general public. It's part sincere architectural landscape proposal, part whimsy, and the project really talks about the British relationship to landscape, the seaside and our nostalgic tendencies, and the anthropogenic sort of impacts of recent times. On the left, you can see this is Bourton on the Water. This is a very famous model village, and we undertook to design a number of installations on the Isle of Sheppey, it is. So that's, imagine, the southeast corner of the UK. So the first, we did 8 schemes, I'll only show you 4. On the right is the Origin, it's called, and it's a mise en beam and abîme, which is a representative technique applied in many model villages, as we created in Liquid Kingdom, and it's where a model hosts a scale model of itself, again, at a 1:20 scale shift. So it's like which is 1:400 in the real island. So it's rather like this here. This is the model village. In the village, there's the village out there. Here's the model village. There's a model village in the model village. And in there is a model village. which is quite exciting, isn't it? Makes you feel dizzy when you see it. So with this project, we really love this idea, and the facsimile of the Isle of Sheppey, so you can see that is an Isle of Sheppey, on the Isle of Sheppey. It gives an overview of the whole island scheme via elevated boardwalks and viewing platforms, cantilevering out of the model. So we did 4 model villages in our model village. Interestingly, we decided to work on Sheppey because I don't know if there's a writer called Douglas Adams, which you may or may not know, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and he has got this book where he gives fantasy meanings to place names in the UK, which are all tremendously hilarious. And one of them is a Sheppey, which he says, I need to read this now, it's defined as the closest distance at which a sheep can still be considered picturesque, essentially a distance of about 7/8 of a mile. So this project was 7/8 of a mile long because of that. So there's another part of the scheme is a gateway, and first impressions count when you arrive at this model village, and that ornamental planting and stuff would seem a little bit strange to us. Instead, there are opportunities for collaborations between landscape architects, road engineers, and artists can all work on here. Sculpted landforms and sort of wetlands at scale and things like that. What could I say about this? Yes, so I guess unlike the American landscape, where the Jefferson grid divides the landscape into parcels of square miles, the British landscape is divided by a cartographic grid that remains very ephemeral. The grid only exists on a notional plane, and it's unaffected by topographical inconsistencies and bureaucratic boundaries. So I'll just run through perhaps some of that. The Ordnance Survey National Grid that dissects the UK into these chunks, grid squares of 100 kilometres across, and then into further units at 10-kilometre spacing. In Liquid Kingdom, we at 1 to 20, so a 10-kilometre grid was then 50 metres, and so on and so forth. And what was quite interesting is this seemed, saying it now, it doesn't seem easy to explain at all, but it was even more difficult to explain in the gallery because the drawings themselves were at scale. So the drawings are at 1 to 100, so you'd say, oh yes, this is 1 to 50, yeah, but it's actually 1 to 100 at 1 to 50 at 1 to 20. Anyway, so it's, yeah, I'm not sure how it went down or it fell flat, I don't know, but they're nice drawings, I think, so. So it's quite an interesting one. This is your country on the left here. You'll recognise this, and we sort of came up with an idea to do one in our country here. So it would be a sort of playground to play in the sea on the edge of this model village, where you could make a model city and see how flooding and things would interact. There could be proper scientific research, but you could actually walk around it and get your ankles wet, so based on the Mississippi River and things like that. And then the last one, and the last image, is about the depot that would hold all the paraphernalia for this model village. And it's based on a site where the Short brothers, who used to design and make seaplanes, as a drone playground and calibration landscape. So it'd have these rolling sheets of material on the top of it, rolling landscape that would allow people who calibrate landscape instruments and things like that to use it as a test site, and it'd be a tensioned canvas landscape. Interestingly, on this site, it was we designed it as a place to look out to the rest of the model village, because it had 2 warning and monitoring organisation posts in the Cold War. So up until the 1990s, they had bunkers on this site. They had 2 bunkers, which both held 3 men. I think there were men back then. And in that one person would be looking at London through a pair of binoculars, another person would be sitting next to a phone, and another person would have a book. And what they were doing was looking for a nuclear attack on London. Full-time job, this. So, and if there are photos of this place, and the person looking through the binoculars would, if there was a mushroom cloud, he had a gradation in his binoculars, and he would say to the person who had the book, it's an 8 or something like that, and the person on the phone would phone somebody up and say, it's an 8, and then that would be that. But they were disbanded in the 80s. But there's so many funny stories about this site, and yeah, I'll probably leave it there as I've gone on a bit. Okay, thank you very much.
How do you decide a project's done?
Oh, we run out of money. No, that's a very good question, actually. That's a very good question because, I mean, there's some students here. There is the phenomena as a tutor and as a student where you think of a project and you think, right, well, this project needs 10 sites, and on each site needs to be 5 buildings, and this is the only way I can describe this thing. And you sort of dial back from there, and you sort of minimize it slightly. But I think for a project like this was quite easy to decide how much it needed because there was a beginning and an end to the model village. So we had an entrance and an exit. So it was a bit of a cheat in a way. And we had 8 moments throughout the thing, so 8 moments defined from our narrative. But even then, the idea, that's not a great answer to when you think it's finished, because we thought of loads of really interesting things to do with this project, post-project, and we still go back to it occasionally. We go back to all of our projects. Wouldn't it be amazing if we made a section of this model village? You know, wouldn't it be great if you could actually walk around some parts of this, plywood models or whatever, that were at 1 to 20, at 1 to 100, at 1 to whatever, and you could go and stick them out in the sea in Sheppey. It wouldn't be too difficult. So I don't know. I'm not sure projects are ever finished. And of course, you know, the reality is you recycle a lot of ideas as well. You know, everyone recycles ideas. I don't think there's anything to be ashamed of. So they don't ever finish. They perhaps just roll into the next one. I don't know. That's a really difficult question, I think. I'm not sure I know the answer.
I mean, one immediate difference that architecture is, of course, never finished, but we imagine it is. But landscape, where you've developed a lot of your practice, is inherently never finished. So I think maybe the projects never are either inherently as well. Last call. All right, let's give Mark a big round of applause. Thanks very much for coming tonight.